Welcome to Not a Roofers podcast, where we discuss roofing
without all the jargon. I'm Breianna.
And I'm Charity.
And this is today's episode. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Not a Roofers podcast. Charity and I are so excited. We have another guest with us, and we'll let him introduce himself.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Reid Ribble. I'm the current CEO of the National Roofing Contractors Association.
So what is the National Roofing Contractors Association?
Well, the National Roofing Contractors Association is kind of what it sounds like. An association is a group of companies or individuals that associate themselves together for some common cause or purpose. So NRCA is how it goes. NRCA is a not-for-profit advocacy organization that advocates on behalf of the roofing industry, both nationally and internationally. So for example, we lobby for building codes that kind of write the rule book that roofing contractors have to follow. We want to have a seat at that table. We work with the federal government on safety regulations. We advocate before Congress. So a lot of different places.
How did you get started in the roofing industry?
Well, it was back when I was 22 years old. My father owned a small roofing company in Menasha, Wisconsin. He was getting ready to retire. I actually think he kind of got antsy to do something different with his life. He was in his early 50s at the time, and he needed someone to take over this roofing business that he had, predominantly residential roofing. And so at age 19, I joined the company, and then at age 22, myself and my brother bought it. And that's how I got into it. So that goes back to 1975 is when I started. I'm aging myself here. 1975 is when I started, bought the company in 1977.
You may be aging yourself a little bit, but we recently found out that you have a Wikipedia page and people can just Google your age.
They can. I did not start that Wikipedia page, but I did have the privilege of serving 6 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, and so people do that kind of stuff, you know. By the way, not everything on my Wikipedia page is accurate, but without regard.
I mean, Wikipedia is not a good source, so we
wouldn't trust it. No, it's kind of whatever anybody wants to put up there, they can put it up there unless I protest. And I have not looked at my personal Wikipedia page for 6 years.
Oh.
So, and here's the interesting little fact. I've never Googled myself, ever.
Really? I have. I've Googled myself.
Yeah. I've Googled you, though.
I've Googled you, too.
Yeah. By the way, you guys realize that not everything on the internet is true, right?
Oh, yes. Of course I know that.
You know, I personally learned that recently.
Yeah. Not everything on there is true, but I just don't, I'm not even remotely interested in seeing what people say about me.
Which is fine.
Yeah.
Fine.
So,
I mean, you have been in the roofing industry for a long time. Did you have a dream before owning the roofing company?
Well, I was pretty young, I was pretty young, and I came from a pretty religious family, and my parents wanted everybody to go to divinity school. So I did that for a year, but realized that being a pastor was not who I was. I wasn't cut from that cloth. Even though my dad and a lot of my brothers were, I just wasn't. And so I also wasn't the greatest student in the world. And so I thought, well, there is one thing I'm pretty good at. I'm pretty good at construction. And so I went and used those skills in a way that provided a livelihood for my family. So I think I got started the same way a lot of people get started in the roofing business. There are not big barriers to entry into that business. And so so it's pretty easy to start if you have a willingness to work hard and go out there and do good work for customers.
So you've been in the roofing industry for a while. How has it changed?
It's changed a lot. I mean, when I first started, really, there was very little government intrusion into the roofing industry. Building codes were relatively lax. Safety requirements were relatively lax. But then the era of big government occurred in the 1970s, and some of those things were for the better, quite frankly. So, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed, which we now affectionately call OSHA, and they brought in a whole new era of awareness on safety and safety training. That was a big change. And then um, back in the day, back in the early '70s when I got started, um, the reality was almost all commercial low slope roofing was bituminous. It was done with asphalt or coal tar pitch. And then this whole new era of single ply roofing came in with PVC and TPO and other polymers, EPDM. And as those things came in, the entire industry changed dramatically. What hasn't changed much is on residential, to be honest with you. Asphalt shingles are still asphalt shingles, even though the reinforcement is fiberglass today rather than organic felt. The technology and the methodology are really identical and have been that way for nearly 100 years. So we're a pretty mature industry. I mean, roofing's been around since the beginning of time. People have always sought shelter, and so it's a pretty important thing to do.
Wow. And you've seen a lot of it over the years.
I have seen a lot of it, and I'll tell you that at the end of the day, the most important possessions that any family has, the most important possessions that you guys have, you have in your home. Whether it's a spouse, it's children's personal belongings and effects, photos and historical things or family heirlooms. And what the roofing industry does is it protects the things that are most important to people. And so absent that protection, we'd be selling shade, and that's not what we do. And so we actually protect the things that matter more than anything to virtually every single consumer in the country. So it's a pretty good trade to be in.
Nice. So we have already talked on our podcast a little bit about the material shortage that is currently happening. And we heard through the grapevine that you know quite a bit more about it than we do.
Well, we have to recognize that the country and really the entire world is working their way and trying to navigate COVID-19. And although a lot of materials for the U.S. roofing industry are sourced, and I'm talking about raw materials, are sourced in the U.S., we do have a global economy, and we do source things abroad. And when the pandemic hit, there was a massive disruption. So the first problem that occurred was the disruption of the pandemic. That disrupted supply chains across the entire world. The second thing that happened that played into this was the fact that the U.S. government stimulated the economy with 50% of the nation's GDP. So out of nowhere, they printed $10 trillion and shoved all this money into the system. So there was a massive spike up in demand. Third, during the pandemic, when certain industries were forced to shut down and quarantine, NRCA was lobbying on behalf of the industry in Washington, D.C. to make sure that the CDC identified roofing as an essential service. And so in most places in the country, the U.S. roofing industry kept on. And so in the early days of the pandemic, when we had the most aggressive shutdowns at the end of March of 2020 and into April, distribution stopped buying. Most roofing companies buy their parts through a distributor. The distributors stopped buying parts from manufacturers. Manufacturers then stopped making those parts. So for about 6 or 8 weeks, there was no production going on. So demand stayed up. All this new money went into the system, and people had nothing to spend it on. I call it the difference between hard purchases and soft purchases. They were doing what we would identify as hard purchases. They were building additions, they were doing landscaping, and they were roofing their homes. Because they couldn't do soft purchases like going to concerts, going out to dinner, buying entertainment, going on vacations. So we had a society that was cash rich but couldn't spend. So what did they do? They fixed up their homes where they were living. That shoved demand up. So production stopped, demand spiked, pandemic limited supply, and then we had a ship that got blocked in the Suez Canal, which stopped shipping for 2 weeks there. We had an ice storm in Texas that stopped the production of certain chemicals that are used in the production of roofing. And it was like a perfect storm. And this material shortage is likely to last into 2022. There's a lot there.
Yeah. There
I
is.
think that's the best explanation I've heard yet, though.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what I get paid to do.
True.
Well, then it's a good thing you're good at explaining it. So with the material shortage, what does that mean for consumers of roofing products?
Well, what it means, a couple things. That they're going to have to wait longer to get their work done, and they're going to pay more to get their work done. And because what you see now is limited supply. In a capitalist society, the laws of supply and demand drive pricing. Demand is high, supply is low, prices are high. And so you're going to have to wait. And if you have an emergency, those that do service work and repair work, they're probably positioned better than any company in the country right now, because that's the bulk of what's going on in America when it comes to roofing, is service and supply. And so because a lot of those components that you do for smaller repairs, just to get somebody over the hump, those products are mostly available without too long of a wait.
Depends on the products you're looking for.
Well, this is true. Remember, distribution is tied up, but for the most part, you can get smaller quantities of certain things that would tide most service companies over. But without regard to that, people are going to wait longer. And the other thing that's in short supply is labor. We've got a real demand for skilled labor. Right now, the U.S. roofing industry has 55 to 60,000 job openings. And so you start to do the arithmetic. We've got a real problem. You can't get parts, you can't get labor. So it's a real dilemma.
Yeah. You look like you want to say something, Charity.
Oh, just really sassy comments that probably shouldn't be said.
So yeah,
that's my internal dialogue.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm currently working on a recruiting video for roof medics to try and get workers. And I know Charity's faced having supplies not available when she's ordering. So
our residential supplies, we can't get residential supplies. We can get commercial supplies, but not residential supplies.
Yeah, that's correct. And that goes back to the fact that most residential manufacturers stopped producing for that time, because a lot of residential roofing, I wouldn't even say a lot, I'd say 99% of it is sold through distribution. And so if the distributors, like I said, stop buying, the manufacturers stop producing. So when they would normally be building inventory, they were not. And they've never been able to catch up.
Yeah. Our customers don't like waiting, though. I've had two people yell at me for 2 weeks already.
Yeah, no customer likes waiting. And